Welcome. This is Mr. Albertson. This is U.S. History 2 at Granite Connection High School. This is our first set of notes. This is on Native peoples in North America. We're first starting off with a general idea called the Vanishing Indian. And the Vanishing Indian is the name for a way of telling the story of Native peoples. And this way of telling the story is one where the Indians sort of disappear. The Indians are there, and then through disease, through war, through conflict with, we call it removal, but conflict with white settlers, the Indians just kind of vanish. And the reason they seem to vanish is that the story is only told from white people's perspective. As we follow white people westward, the Indians just disappear everywhere we look because we're only looking at white people. And the problem with this story is it leads to an idea of destiny or fate, that it suggests that white people were destined to take over the continent, and the Indians were destined to, again, disappear. This story, of course, is very biased towards the white perspective, and therefore biased against the Indian perspective. So what we want to do instead is try to tell a story with Native people at the center of the narrative, at least whenever we can. So these two blue circles, these are kind of against each other. And put like little verses there. They're competing ways of telling the story of the early years of settlement. So a couple of things just to keep in mind. Every colony was different. Every tribe was different. That's all this means here is we just got to keep straight the fact that we're talking in some generalities, but different tribes did things differently and different colonies did things differently. I want to talk about the Iroquois tribe particularly. The Iroquois was really a group of tribes, a group of 5 tribes that were situated in New York between the English and French colonies. They're also, and that's why they're also called the Five Nations. The Iroquois were strong enough that they kept Americans out, the English settlers out of parts of the interior for quite a long time. They weren't able to win the war, but they were able to protect their lands quite a bit. They also acquired Western weapons and were able to use those guns and to some extent swords, but guns particularly to attack other Indian tribes, particularly ones to the west of them. And the Iroquois' form of warfare, and I'm going to really highlight this right here, this is super important, and this is super important right here. So the Iroquois used a form of war that we now call the mourning war. And mourning here means after the loss of a loved one. You're in mourning, you're sad. So the mourning war is the idea that if you lost someone in your family, you might go on a raid, capture someone from a different tribe or a white settler, but often another Indian. Capture someone from a different tribe, bring them back to your camp, and begin to torture them. And then a female member, a woman from the family who lost someone, would get to step in and determine whether or not to save this captive's life or let them be tortured to death. So women would determine whether or not to adopt, which was often the case. Frequently people were adopted in. That was the most common result. Adopt or kill. And this speaks to the fact that women weren't in charge of everything in Iroquois society, but women were given important decisions to make, like life or death decisions over prisoners of war. The most famous example of this, of course, is Pocahontas with John Smith. He's captured by Indians, by the Powhatan tribe, and the chief's daughter, Pocahontas, steps in and saves his life. And John Smith, of course, describes this as she's in love with him, when really, if you know about the Mourning War, you see that she's just playing the role that the chief's daughter would be expected to play. It's her job to decide whether or not he lives or dies. And we read a story about this in class. Mary Rowlandson, she's captured by Indians. That's one of your assignments. You can read it yourself. That's in the module. Now, so the Iroquois also attacked the Algonquin, which are just to the west. So the Algonquin ally with the French. That's just a little minor detail. The 7 Years' War is important for a couple of reasons. The 7 Years' War is a major war where the French and the Algonquin fight against the English and their tribal allies. So it's English and French, each with their Indian allies fighting against each other. And what's important about this is two things, two major reasons. This is the height of Indian power See if I can write that. Height of Indian, writing with the mouse is hard. Height of Indian power. Okay, height of Indian power, and it's also when George Washington becomes famous. George Washington is a minor military officer, and he's on a British military expedition going up north to fight in Canada against the French. And this British army group is ambushed by Indians, by Native Americans. They're shot up pretty badly. The general's killed, and Washington, young officer, steps in, takes over command, and leads them back through the forest under constant attack, gets them all the way back relatively safely. And through this, George Washington becomes the most famous military commander, the most famous military person in the colonies, which is why he's selected to be general once the revolution begins. So two things, it's the height of Indian power, and it's the beginning of George Washington's personal fame. There's some other Indian rebellions. One of them, Pontiac's War, I'm not going to get into any details about it. I'm just going to mention that Pontiac's War is the moment when a lot of colonists begin to really hate the Indians. The Pontiac's War doesn't go very well because the Indians have to get ammunition from the English because the French are not as willing to help after the 7 Years' War. So they can't get gunpowder from the French, and once they start fighting the English, they can't get gunpowder from anyone, and so the rebellion falls apart. And we see this over and over where Indian rebellions tend to be limited by the fact that they can't make their own ammunition. So, and the last little bit here, this just says that once the revolution happened between the colonies and England, that a lot of tribes lose all access to the British and the French, and they then are in that same position with the Americans, where if they try to fight back, they don't have any ammunition. They have very little ammunition and no one to buy it from. But Native Americans are able to fight back at various points, and we see soon we will see the rise of Andrew Jackson, who will, as president, remove many tribes of Indians in the 1820s and take over their land for white settlement. That's the end for this segment. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.